Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Parent Academy. I'm actually Allison Cortez from the Communication Department here at Academy District 20, and I would just like to welcome everybody to our event this evening. And as you can tell, we're having a virtual Parent Academy. We're here on Microsoft Teams. We're keeping it super organic. We've got a few different presenters with us. And before we get started, I'd just like to kind of make sure you're familiar with the platform and lay down a couple ground rules. So this afternoon, or this evening, I guess now that it is, we will do, we're going to do a presentation about quarantines and isolations, and that will be led by Becky Allen. And so Becky will lead that presentation. And then after that presentation, we'll open it up for questions. And we've got almost 100 people with us already. So to keep things simple and easy, we ask that everybody use the chat box, and it's called the meeting chat box, and you'll see it down on your screen. Sort of looks like a little box that you would see in an old school cartoon. So you just look for that chat box, and if you have questions as we go, just pop those questions in that chat box. We're not going to answer the questions one for one because we anticipate that there will be quite a number of them. So we will throughout the evening be combing through them looking for themes and group-like questions together. So know that we'll be doing that. So anytime something pops into your brain, just put it in the chat box. And then when we open it up for Q&A, we'll start to go through the questions that way. A few other pieces of housekeeping. We want to make sure in that chat box that, we keep it clean. I know sometimes this is an emotional topic. Sometimes people are, sort of feeling frustrated about things, but, try to pull the emotion out when you put chats in there. And also we ask that if you maybe run into some frustrations or have some concerns about certain staff or different teachers, this is not the place to air that dirty laundry. And we ask that you don't call individuals out by name. And then if you have personal questions about a situation that you've maybe had, we ask that you follow up with us online about that, because we don't want to go down those rabbit holes. We really want to look at those big questions that everybody might be experiencing right now. So that's sort of, that kind of has all of our housekeeping right there. Before we get going, I wanted to make sure that everybody does know that we are recording this. So if your evening goes sideways, you need to pop off for a bit, no worries. We will get this recording up on asd20.org. So if you can only stay with us for a bit, you can watch the rest later. And if you need closed captioning, another thing that is down here, there's you should see 3 little dots on the bottom. And when you click on that, you can turn on your closed captioning. With that, I say we get started. We want to make sure we don't take up too much of your evening. So first, I'd like to introduce our panelists this evening. And tonight, we're actually being joined by members of what we call our COVID response team. And these are individuals throughout the district with very specialized backgrounds, and they come together and they are daily working on all of the isolations and quarantines that go through our district. Some days that's 10, some days it's 15, and some days it's 30. It just all depends on the day, but they've worked through a number of those. So I am going to let them go around. I'm going to say their name, and then they're going to pop on here and tell you a little bit more about themselves. So first, I'd like to introduce Becky Allen. Becky, why don't you say hi to everyone?
Becky, you're on mute at the moment. You're mute.
Hi, I'm Becky Allen, who clearly, after many Microsoft Teams meetings, still forgets to unmute. So again, my name is Becky Allen. I'm in my 2nd year as Chief Financial Officer in District 20. I've been in District 20 since 2006. I've been a high school math teacher. I was the assistant principal and principal at Discovery Canyon campus, and worked in learning services, and now really enjoy my service here in District 20 as Chief Financial Officer, and have been included in this work around our COVID response.
Our next panelist this evening, I'm just going to go as I see your photos. Our next panelist is Peter Ristig.
Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Ristig. I'm the Director for Risk Management for the district. I'd like to apologize in advance. I'm battling a little bit of a cold myself. So if I'm a little difficult to understand, I apologize for that. I've been with the district now for about 2 years in the risk management department. Prior to that, I worked in higher education and have a long background in HR as well.
Our next panelist is actually Michael Arsenault. Michael?
Hey, I'm Michael Arsenault. I'm a director for human resources here in District 20. Prior to that, I've been an assistant principal at Timberview Middle School, a TOSA for Academy Online High School, and a math teacher at Pine Creek High School. I've been with the district since about 2003, and a lot of my focus on the COVID response team tends to be more the staff side of things.
And our final panelist is Marcia Deyong. I think I saw Marcia came in. There she is.
I'm pulling a Becky there with the microphone. I'm Marcia Deyong. I have been with the district for about 8 years. I have been the lead nurse for the district for the last 5 years. And this year I'm serving as the medical side, nurse side, and the liaison for the students on the COVID response team.
So as I said, these are some members of our COVID response team. We have several others, which is so great because, as you can imagine, it takes a whole village as we're working our way through these isolations and quarantines daily. But we wanted to pull together the core members because we know that throughout this semester, we've gotten several questions about isolations and quarantines. It can be both confusing and alarming if you get that phone call that you've been put on quarantine. So although we've got some resources on the website, we thought sometimes nothing helps better than a chat. And while we can't all physically come together, we thought let's use our Microsoft Teams and pull everybody together so that we can help answer some of those questions and do a little level setting so folks know why we do what we do, how we do it, and what impacts it may have to you if you find yourself in that situation. So I'm now going to hand it over to Becky Allen, and she is going to present the overview of what isolations and quarantines means here in Academy District 20.
Thank you, Allison. I appreciate that introduction. And audience members, at this point, I am going to go ahead and share my screen. And Allison, can you see that okay?
We sure can.
Okay, thank you. So, as Allison shared, really the purpose of this evening is to give you a sneak peek into the process. I can guarantee that regardless of who you are out there, a staff member, a community member, a parent, a student, each and every one of you has been impacted in some way by the quarantines and the isolations that have happened here in District 20, whether they've personally happened to you, whether they've happened to someone you know, certainly it is something that you have felt the impact of. And if I wasn't on this side of it, where I really was a part of this COVID response team, I probably would be wondering, how do they make the decisions? What are they basing this on? How do they come up with the dates? How do they know who gets quarantined, who doesn't? And so hopefully this evening, when you leave this presentation at 7:30, you will have a better sense of the process that we go through. Now, it's important to note that the guidance that we follow is the guidance that was authored by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and it is also the same guidance that is used at El Paso County Public Health. With El Paso County Public Health, we talk with them on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times a day. Sometimes the communication is going from us, the school district, to them, and at other times they are contacting us with positive information about COVID cases, questions about contact tracing, etc. We do not communicate that much directly at the state level. Again, that's more a local conversation that happens. but both entities are utilizing the same guidance, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit tonight, so you have a sense of what we are operating from. I included these links. Some of the slides that I will show you this evening come directly from this guidance. You can easily go to either one of these websites and you can pull this information up to also see it just at your leisure. So who is on this District 20 COVID response team? I will tell you, when we had our very first case, it was August 24th, which was the first day of school, and we had our first issue, if you will, that morning. And I can remember taking a phone call from the principal, hanging up, and then calling Human Resources and hanging up, and then calling Allison in Communications and hanging up. And it only took me being in the first case that I realized we all need to be a part of this decision making, and we all need to be present when we have a case so that we have multiple people representing multiple roles coming together with their various levels of expertise to really assess the situation and make a decision for how to move forward. And with that, we have what we call a COVID huddle. And all of these huddles are via Microsoft Teams, just like this. Sometimes, as Allison said in the beginning, maybe we had 5 or 6 huddles. Now we have 25 plus huddles in a single day where we're looking at different cases and again, analyzing it and deciding how to proceed, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a moment. Who's on this team? Michael Arsenault from Human Resources, you met him just a moment ago. He has some other folks in Human Resources who support his work. From Business Services, Pete Ristig, you met him just a moment ago, and myself support this work. Mrs. Deyong, who you met also, our lead nurse, is a part of the process, of course, and on the huddle team, and our friends in Communications, Allison and her teammates as well. Also, we have the principal from the school level. Sometimes it's the assistant principal, sometimes it's even other staff from the school joining the principal, and then the principal supervisor is often part of the process as well. And we come together to review the information. Now, in these blue boxes at the bottom of your screen, you see other critical parts of our team, of our response team. They're not in the huddle, but they have critical pieces and get pulled in when applicable. The first one is what's on the left we call the OCRT, called the Organic Cleaning Response Team. So when we know that a particular location in a school or in one of our facilities has had a possible or a probable or a definite exposure to COVID, then we deploy this organic cleaning response team to do a deep clean and sanitize of the area. And so we have daily communication with the organic cleaning response team. Sometimes at night, in the evening, they will do this OCRT process at 10 sites, 5 sites. Just a number. The latest that I've ever gotten a response back that they've cleaned in preparation for the next day was 2 a.m. So they work very hard to not only do a thorough job, but to do it in a timely manner so that we don't hold up educating our students that next day and welcoming our staff in. Transportation, we work with our friends there as well because sometimes we have students who are sparking a quarantine who have ridden the bus. And so we have to determine, were they on the bus? Do they have close contacts there? We look at videos. We know, were they on the AM bus, the PM bus, etc. And then food service. Food service, our Sodexo partners have had to pivot because perhaps there's a lot of students and staff on quarantine, so they have to amend their meal preparation. We have remote meal service. Sometimes, for example, at Doug Valley Elementary School on base, as you know, it's on the Air Force Academy, and so they had to be closed a period of time, and we were able to provide some local food service at Air Academy High School to make it easier for our service members to access meals while their children were at home. It's important to note too on this response team that this is not what I call a 9 to 5 response team Monday through Friday. This response team does an outstanding job, and they are timely with their response. This team meets from morning until night. Some of the latest that we've done, 10 p.m. typically, and Saturdays and Sundays are of course included because we typically get information any day, any time, and if we know that we need to act on that information, we don't want to wait. So my admiration truly goes out to the folks on this team for their hard work. They just have done an amazing job, and they truly care about kids and staff. Now, before we get into some of the details of the guidance that we have from the state and the county, let's talk just a moment about vocabulary for two very important words. You'll hear these terms throughout all of the work that we do as a COVID response team. The top one is isolation. Isolation refers to someone who is positive for COVID or someone who's sick. It's that person who we think has been impacted by COVID, and they stay at home and away from others during that isolation period. Now, scientists and physicians have determined that the isolation period needs to last for 10 days. This means that typically someone positive for COVID will be infectious for a 10-day period, and beyond that 10 days, they are not infectious anymore. Certainly, if someone is still displaying symptoms, they are not able to return, but that isolation period is 10 days for that reason. At the bottom of the screen, we have far more quarantines. Quarantines involve the healthy individuals. They are not symptomatic. They are not positive with COVID. However, they have potentially been exposed to someone who has COVID or COVID-like symptoms. They also have to stay at home away from others, and their quarantine period is 14 days because, again, scientists and physicians have determined that once someone is exposed to COVID, they would typically manifest symptoms within 14 days. That's why those time periods, because when I first heard it, I said, that doesn't make sense. Why would the person who has COVID be home less than the person who doesn't? But now I understand the 10 and 14 days, and that's what's behind it. So how does the COVID response team get started? Well, one of two ways. On the top part of your screen, we get information from a school, from a parent, from a staff member, that a student or staff member is showing symptoms. And what you see in this chart right here, and I hope you can see me moving my mouse just to point that out, the health department has classified symptoms into 3 different categories. On the left, we have what's called a critical symptom. And you've probably heard on the news that there's quite often a high correlation between a loss of taste or smell and COVID-19. It has not been 100% for us. Sometimes someone has lost taste or smell and they've not been positive for COVID, yet it is labeled as a critical symptom, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. Major symptoms are fevers, cough, and shortness of breath or difficulty breathing. And minor symptoms, things like sore throat, runny nose, body aches, headache, fatigue, diarrhea, nausea, things that you could experience from a bad cold or even having a meal the night before that did not set right with you. So again, I'll show you what our assessment process is, but this is one way that this whole process gets kicked off. The second way is at the bottom. Perhaps we have a student or staff member who is confirmed positive for COVID-19. This person may be exhibiting symptoms, but also, of course, as you know from watching TV and know probably within just your circle of who you may or may not know, sometimes people are positive with COVID and show no symptoms at all. Now, this is an example. This is the flow chart, and I promise I'm not going to go through this bit by bit, but I wanted you to see what we see. This is the flow chart that we have received from the state and the same one that is used at El Paso County Public Health. This is the process that we use to determine when we are evaluating a student, what do we do next? So here's where we start. It's this red box right here. We start with one of 3 questions that we have to go through. The first question is, so now we've got someone, and did they test positive for COVID-19? If that answer is yes, we are required. We label this a red box. It's just our internal vocabulary that we use. We say we have a red box. That means that we are required to not only send that person home, but to dismiss immediately the close contacts. That means we're going to have a quarantine. And it says here, red box, immediate. Doesn't mean we wait a few days and think it over, or we wait till we have more time. It means that we are quarantining close contacts. The second thing we look at is, let's say someone has a sore throat. We ask the question, have you been in close contact with anyone positive for COVID-19? If they say yes, even for something as simple as a sore throat or a runny nose, if they have been in close contact with someone who is COVID positive, they now have a new symptom. It sparks an immediate quarantine of the close contacts. Finally, remember I talked about that critical symptom on the slide prior? Well, the health department has identified loss of taste or smell as what's called a critical symptom. If anyone has a new loss of taste or smell, even if they're saying, no, I have a bad cold, I'm congested, my nose is all stuffed up, and that's why I can't smell, and that's why I can't taste my food. We don't have leeway. If someone has new loss of taste or smell, it is an immediate quarantine of the close contacts. Now, when I say this, again, we get red box situations, and they are a priority nights and weekends as well, because we know there are families out there who want to know that their child or their spouse or their sister or their brother, etc., that those folks have been impacted, and we want to get that quarantine information to them as fast as we can. And again, those close contacts are quarantined. Now, many of you have probably heard of situations, or you have been on the receiving end of a quarantine that you were notified of for 14 days, and a day or two later you get a message saying, good news, your quarantine has been lifted early. And you say, what are they doing there in District 20? So I want to explain how this works. So it's important to know that this red box, these immediate quarantines, these quarantines will never end early. Even if someone with the loss of taste or smell goes home and gets a COVID test and it's negative, we are required to have the close contacts and this person with the loss of taste or smell complete their full isolation and quarantine periods. It is in the guidance, we cannot lift those things early. Just like with a positive COVID test or someone with new symptoms who had close contact with someone with COVID-19, those quarantines cannot lift early. So those would never be a situation where you're going to get an early notice, hey, after 2 days, come back. All right, so this is what we call our red box, okay? Now, not everybody falls into this red box category. We've got other symptoms down here. We've got fever and cough and all of that. So let's say that we have a staff member or student and they have a new cough and a fever. And we say, you positive for COVID? No, I haven't even gotten a test for COVID. Okay, next. Have you been in close contact with anyone with COVID-19? No, I haven't been in close contact with anyone COVID-19. Have you lost your taste or smell? No, I still have that. Okay, now we move into a different phase of this chart. It's something that we have nicknamed the yellow box, and it's this area right here. The best way for me to describe it is that it is a 4-day holding tank. It's time that we assess what's happening. So when we move into this yellow box, the person who had, I mentioned, a fever and a cough, I look on the chart down here, and that's considered major symptom. They have to resolve those symptoms fully within 24 hours of onset. Otherwise, the only way they will come out of this holding tank is with a negative COVID test. This is why we encourage our staff and students as early on in the process that we enter this yellow box holding tank to get a COVID test. Because let's say someone says, yeah, I have the cough and the fever, and within 24 hours it resolves. Great, they're back to school. We're good. The whole thing ends. But what if their cough or their fever lingers past the 24 hours? Well, they can't automatically go back to school. They are now in the holding tank. And the only way for them to come out of the holding tank and go back to school is to have a negative COVID test. But here's what's even bigger than that, the bigger amount of people that are impacted. If this person reaches the end of the 4-day holding tank time, maybe they got a test, but they never got their results. Then at the end of when this 4-day holding tank ends, we now have to go back and contact trace all of the close contacts, and those folks have to be quarantined on that 4th day when that holding tank has expired. Now, you may yourself or may know people who got released from a quarantine early. So let me show you how that can happen. The person has cough or fever. It did not resolve within 24 hours. They know now the only way out of the holding tank is a negative COVID test. They now go to the Citadel, or they go to the new location in Falcon, or the location in Monument, or they go to UC Health and they get a COVID test. But the results don't come in. All of a sudden, we're at the end of the 4-day period. We know that the symptoms didn't resolve within 24 hours, and we don't have the test results. We then have to contact trace and quarantine the close contacts. Guess what? Maybe the next day we get this person's COVID test and it's negative. A day earlier, we would have never quarantined anyone. But now we reach back out and we say the quarantine lifts early. So that is why if you had that experience, that's most likely a very plausible scenario of what happened. Now, also, we sometimes have families who choose not to get a test. And so if those symptoms don't resolve within what's in these green boxes, this period of time, 24 hours if you have a major, 48 hours if they're all minor, then we're not coming out of the holding tank because we won't get COVID results because a test is not occurring. And then the close contacts remain quarantined for the 14 days. Of course, another possibility in here is that a COVID test comes in and it's positive. If that's the case, of course, we quarantine all the close contacts for 14 days, and it cannot be reversed because it's a positive COVID case. So when we are in this process, how do we go about determining who the close contacts are? Do we just say, you know what? I don't know. This is tough. Let's just send this whole grade level out. Let's just send this whole, this is a 3rd grade teacher. Let's just, you know what? Let's just send all 3rd grade teachers home at the school. We don't do that. We don't want to quarantine any more people than we have to. And we don't want to quarantine any less people. We simply want to follow the guidelines that the health department has set out. And sometimes that's not an easy process. It's a long process to contact trace, but we know that a quarantine that's a family impact because we are giving a family now that this student is supposed to stay at home for 14 days. That's a family impact, and we know it's a big impact. So we truly strive to just do what the guidelines say, no more, no less. So there's two critical ingredients to determining who the close contacts are. The first one is when. What is the period of time that we have to contact trace? Should we just say, we better look at it for the whole last week? I would feel better if we look at it for the whole last week. No, again, we want to scientifically determine the window of time that we are contact tracing. How it works is the day the symptoms started is considered what we call day 0. We have to back up by 48 hours, and that becomes our contact tracing time. So the 48 hours before the person developed symptoms through whenever people still had contact with this person becomes the window of time. Sometimes you find out that someone's symptoms started on a Monday and they happen to be at home that day. You back up 48 hours, that's Saturday, Sunday, no contact tracing. They weren't at school, they weren't at events. Sometimes you find out that someone had symptoms a few days ago and they've been in school. So we're counting multiple days that they've been in school and going back 48 hours. It truly depends on each independent situation. And we analyze, we figure out the dates. People laugh at me because I was a math major and they have formulas in their heads on how to calculate the time periods. I still use a calendar and count it out with my finger because I feel like that's better for me. But we literally go to that detail. Then we have to look at where. Okay, where were close contacts? So the criteria that we get, this is all in the county and state guidance, is a close contact is considered, one example is if they were in a classroom or an enclosed space with the individual for 40 minutes or greater. And what is very important about that 40 minutes, we may be contact tracing over 2 or 3 days. It's not 40 minutes per day. It's 40 minutes cumulatively over the length of time. So let's say I'm a principal at an elementary school. I've got a student in one of my classrooms. I don't know it, but they are symptomatic, what have you. There's a contact tracing period, and I've stopped in that classroom over the last 3 days, which is the contact tracing time, for 15 minutes each day. 15 plus 15 plus 15, 45 minutes, I'm quarantined. If I just went for 10 minutes each day, 10 plus 10 plus 10, I'm at 30 minutes, I'm not quarantined. We have contact tracing logs on every door in every classroom in every one of our schools. We are able to see what service providers, the speech language pathologist went in, the principal went in, so a para went in, etc. They mark the times in and out, and we have the dates. We go person by person, and we have to cumulatively assess whether or not someone was a close contact or not, given being in that enclosed space. The second one is if people are masked, were they within 6 feet? Picture a bubble around someone that has a 6 feet zone. Was someone within that zone for 15 minutes or more when both were masked in that 6-foot zone cumulatively over 3 days? If they were, it's a close contact. If people are unmasked, then the bubble gets bigger. You have to be more than 12 feet away. And again, it's a cumulative 15 minutes or greater. Sometimes the contact tracing process at a complex environment where you have, at an elementary school, my son is in 1st grade at DCC Elementary, and he mainly stays with his class all day. They travel together, they go to PE together, any discoveries or specials together. So the contact tracing is a bit more straightforward. At a high school, for example, they cohort absolutely to the extent possible, but sometimes it's less possible when you have mixing of classes. I have calculus, I have this one. You don't necessarily stay with the same group of students all day long for every class. So we're looking at multiple classes, we're looking at multiple people. We have sometimes for cases spent hours just doing the contact tracing for staff and students. Now, these next 3 slides, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but I want to give you a sense of how the process changes depending upon our dial in the state of Colorado. And you know what I mean by the dial. It's in this upper left-hand box. It's also here. It's that dial that shows us what level are we in the county of El Paso with respect to COVID. So on the left, the least restrictive. Least restrictive, the data are looking the best. They're the lowest data that we are going to see. It's called Protect Our Neighbor. And the restrictions are the least amount. As we move up the dial, these next 3, the blue, yellow, and orangey, they're safer at home. Level 1 was what we were in up until Election Day, November 3rd. Then we moved to level 2, not District 20, El Paso County, moved to level 2, safer at home. And then there's level 3, safer at home, and then stay at home as well. So what I want to give you a glimpse into is when a student is symptomatic, how do we bring that student back, and how does that change based upon this dial? So this is Protect Our Neighbor. We're not in that. We are right here. So it's going to be a while before we get back to Protect Our Neighbor. But let's say that we have someone who's ill. And I don't mean these criteria. Yeah, you're positive for COVID, loss of taste or smell, etc. Not talking about that. Talking more about these yellow boxes. So when you get into this, how does the ill person get to come back to school before their isolation period of 10 days ends? So how do they come back early? Well, they can have a negative COVID test. The PCR refers to a COVID test. It's the type of test where they swab. It's not the quick test. The health department does not sanction us to accept that a quick action or quick test to be able to come, a rapid test to come back quickly. We need the typical swab test. What's important here is, or we can have a physician's alternate diagnosis. So there's 2 ways to come back in, 2 different tickets you could have to come in. Keep in mind, it does not matter if you have loss of taste or smell, COVID positive, contact with, that's the full isolation and quarantine for everyone. This up top will not bring it back. But keep in mind, negative COVID test or alternate diagnosis. Now, let's look at levels 1 and 2, and that's where we are. We're safer at home, level 2. How does a person get back? Only one way now. I purposely crossed through alternate diagnosis because it will not be accepted now. The health department says only the negative COVID test is the ticket back. Then, if we accelerate, if we were to move to level 3 of safer at home, it gets even tighter. Negative COVID test, and that's an important distinction. You need 2 tickets to come back. A negative COVID test and a lab-based alternate diagnosis. What does that mean? It means it cannot be a doctor's note saying, Becky has an earache, she has a sinus infection. I would have to produce some type of lab-based alternate diagnosis. For some things, I'm not a doctor, but I don't even think there are lab tests for certain things. Strep is an easy one, right? I could have a negative COVID test and a positive strep test. I can show what I had, but some things are not possible to have an alternate lab-based test. And that's because it's such a restrictive environment. The threshold to return is ultra conservative and ultra restrictive. Now, before I get into the question section, I want to talk just a moment about pivoting to e-learning. Because I'm sure that you have seen situations and you and your families may have been directly impacted by either a classroom, multiple classrooms, at middle school, a team, a grade level of teams, or an entire school pivoting to e-learning. I want to explain why we have done that sometimes. And it's been one of two reasons. The vast majority of the reasons, vast, 99.9% of the time, we have had to pivot to e-learning because when we do the contact tracing process, we end up with such a significant number of staff members quarantined that we simply cannot open the building. We've had all the front office, the principal, assistant principal, multiple teachers, and we cannot open the building. We've had schools 25, 30 staff members quarantined at one building. We do not have the staff, the subs to come in. So the vast majority of our pivot to e-learning has been that we simply stated, do not have enough staff to safely operate the school. We have not had a situation where the health department has said, Becky, you need to close down this school. We have not had that. A couple of times at one, I remember specifically the example I gave you about the 10 o'clock at night. It was a Sunday night at 10 o'clock. We were working a COVID huddle for an elementary school. And we realized that the information we received, we probably started about 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And we realized we can't get through all this tonight. We can't complete all the contact tracing. We can't contact all the parents at 11 or midnight. We said, you know what, we're going to close tomorrow. And we closed for one day just so that we had enough time to adequately contact trace. Because again, we don't want to do more and we don't want to do less. And there are so many complexities. It's enough that we're just contact tracing in the school building, but add on to it if the student rode the bus. We are then going back. We're getting with transportation. What are the days? Were they AM, PM, just AM, not Tuesday, yes, Wednesday? Where did they sit on the bus? We have to look at the video. Who was in a radius? Were they on the bus for 5 minutes, 15 minutes? You get the drift. There's a lot of details. Also, we have some of our students who use our before and after school care. Those are vendors, outside vendors. We don't run those. We need to consult with them. If they have attended that, we have to contact trace also those folks who have attended there, any staff members who attended from the company, and any kids who have attended there as well. So those are the two times that we've pivoted to e-learning when, one, the vast majority, we simply cannot operate the school. We don't have the staff. And a few times that, look, we need tomorrow to contact trace. And then often we will do our deep clean on that day as well. So again, I hope this gives a little bit of background to the process and maybe filled in a couple of blanks in terms of some experiences that you have had personally. But now I'm going to give it back to Allison Cortez because she is now going to facilitate a question and answer period so that we can help and the panelists can help articulate hopefully some answers to some questions that you have. So I'm going to now unshare my screen and you'll see our pictures again.
Thank you, Becky, so much. Okay, so I'm going to get started. I've been monitoring the chat questions, and I'm actually going to start with a question that just came a few moments ago, and I provided a partial answer, but it's a little more complicated than that, so I wanted to go a little further into the answer, and it correlates to what you were just saying. So one of the questions an attendee asked was, is she hearing correctly that to get back to school, students need to have a negative test and a negative lab test? Now that could be correct, but it really depends on the dial system. Could you explain that? Just got to unmute, Becky.
I'm telling you, I can't get that skill under control. It is absolutely dependent on the dial. Right now we're kind of at that level 2, if you will. We're at safer at home 1 or 2. And so 1 ticket, negative COVID test. And again, I want to be clear that there's nothing that can bring you back early if you have COVID, have symptoms and been around someone who's positive, or have loss or taste of smell. Even if you have a negative COVID test, it doesn't get you back in. If we were to go to safer at home 3, which is the next level of restriction, then for people to come back early from their isolation, so not fulfill their entire 10-day isolation period, they need 2 things: the negative COVID test and the lab-based alternate diagnosis.
Okay, so next question, and this we get a lot. So what happens if your child is quarantined, sent home to quarantine? What does the rest of the family do, especially if you have other children that go to other schools in our district?
So I'll take that question there, Allison. The answer to that really depends on a couple different factors. One is if your student has been sent home for a quarantine and they are not symptomatic, excuse me, and they are not symptomatic, then the rest of the family does not require any quarantine. You can continue with your daily lives. However, if your student is on a quarantine and then they start to develop symptoms, there may be a need for the other family members to quarantine. In these cases, I would strongly recommend that you reach out to your school, let them know of the development of new symptoms in this situation, and then allow the school to help walk you through that process.
Thanks, Pete. So next question is, you might be somebody who at some point gets a phone call and they've told you you're going to need to be home for 24 days. Not 10, not 14, but 24. Can you explain to the audience why somebody would be out for 24 days?
Certainly. So in order to best answer that question, I want to take a moment, step back, and explain a little bit about how the disease itself works. Okay. So when someone starts developing symptoms or they are otherwise diagnosed with COVID-19, they may be symptomatic for up to 10 days. In some rare cases where there's someone who is extremely immunocompromised, it could be a longer period of time. But in most individuals, within 10 days, they have run the course of the disease and they are no longer symptomatic. Now, at any point in time during that 10-day window that you're symptomatic, you are infectious, and someone can get infected anytime during that 10-day window. Now, the disease does not immediately manifest in people who get sick. And so what we have is that once you've been exposed, the disease typically shows up anywhere from 2 to 14 days following the exposure. So if we look at that collectively, someone in your household could be fine for the first 9 days of the infectious period and actually get the disease on day 10. Then it could take up to 14 days for them to develop symptoms from that disease. So you take the long end of both sides and say 10 days of infection plus 14 days to become sick from that infection. And that's where we get the 24 days from.
Thanks again. So here's another question, and I feel like it might be related to communication. So I'm going to throw that out there, and then I might pop in with an answer. So one of the questions was, sometimes parents and guardians and families are receiving multiple emails over the course of a few days about quarantines. And they ask, when should we start to get concerned about this? When do we need to do something? And so I'm going to go out on a limb there. And I just want to explain the communication process for a second, because that's actually something we didn't talk about. And from a communication standpoint, when these situations come into a huddle, what we want to do is we always communicate internally. So we want to reach out to any of those folks who have been put in isolation and quarantine. We need to talk to them right away. So they're our first phone calls. And then after that, we work with our school leaders to let their staff know what is going on, whether it's a classroom, a cohort, multiple classes, or the whole building. But we let those staff know. And then we do a full community communication, meaning everybody at that school. And some may say, why did you do that? My classroom wasn't impacted. And we just early on in this process made a decision to be completely transparent. We know that the only way you can make the best decision for your family is if you're given all of the information. And to be quite frank, oftentimes if we don't let you know quick enough, your neighbor is going to let you know anyway. So we want to make sure that we're keeping those lines of communication open and clear, and we're being completely transparent. So it sounds like you might be getting those community-wide notifications that multiple classrooms have been quarantined and it maybe isn't impacting you. Now, when should you start to do things? That's when we reach out to you and we say you've been quarantined, you've been isolated, or you get a big communication that the whole school has moved to e-learning. So I think, guys, do you think that answers that question? Is a little more about communication than anything else? Okay. So next question we have, let's see. So, this is a great one because we get this one a lot. So when we do that contact tracing, and we do the contact tracing that happened in a school or a classroom, what happens if things are happening after class, maybe at a football practice, maybe at a before school, maybe at one of our before school programs? How is that considered in this process?
So we go through a pretty exhaustive process when it comes to contact tracing, looking not only at specifically the classroom or cohort, but also other activities occurring outside of that. So again, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about how things have changed within the operations of the district to account for that. If you look at any level of the district, we have altered the way we go about our regular daily activities. And that can range anywhere from, as Becky mentioned earlier, the contact tracing logs that are kept on doors, to how football practices are organized to limit exposure amongst the teams and the players on the various teams at a high school level. And so because of that, when we meet up to discuss a symptomatic student or a symptomatic staff member, we have a pretty exhaustive process that looks at a number of factors, such as extracurricular activities. We talk about whether that student is moving around in the school for various support services or anything else. We rely on personal interviews often. We rely on, some schools have implemented digital contact tracing using QR codes to scan in and out of places. And we have extensive scheduling that we review as well. In some cases, we even go so far as to review video footage in order to see interactions at a lunchtime that is a little bit more unregulated. But throughout our huddle, we gather information from all of those types of sources and really put that together into a complete contact tracing effort. I do want to emphasize that sometimes this is not a very quick process. It can take hours in many cases. And so we try to be as thorough as possible and make sure that we are correctly identifying only those people who truly are close contacts.
The next question we've gotten a few times is folks are wondering, where could they get one of these tests? Where might they be able to go to get a COVID test should they need one?
So one of the easiest places to go is kind of through the guidance of the El Paso County Health Department. There are a few sites that you can go to. I know that one is down at the Citadel Mall. I'm going to try to put it out in the chat right now as we're kind of talking through this. There's also one, I think, up north of Monument now at St. Patrick's, but all of those testing sites use what are called a PCR test, a polymer chain reaction test. And that test is a molecular test that Becky was talking about earlier that takes a few days to get results on, but has a better accuracy rate. That's instead of a rapid antigen test, which can have a lot of false negatives. So I'm going to grab that link right now from El Paso County Health. I'm going to put it out in the chat, and those are places that you can go to get that testing.
Thanks, Michael. So,
Michael, Allison, I just want to add in there, that testing is free. You do not need a doctor's referral, and you don't need insurance. You just go and you get the test. You can register in advance online, but no doctor's order required.
And a false negative, I mean, it's, if you think of like an X, right? You can have a positive that's true. You can have a positive that's false. You can have a negative that's true and a negative that's false. And so a false negative is just a possibility that a test result is not actually what it says it is. It can happen with positives too. With these tests, I don't know the exact amount that's kind of there for each of those, but the PCR has a much better accuracy rate and shows less false positives. And Marcia, you may have some input on that too. I don't know.
I actually do. The false negatives with the COVID test, because they are so new to the testing world, they can be in certain tests from 2 to 37%. They can also be up to 50% incorrect with the negatives. That's why they insist on the PCR test for the negative results. However, positive tests, they are finding less than 2% of the positive tests, even if they're rapid, are incorrect. So if you got a rapid test and it was positive, we would accept that one. But the PCR test is the golden standard for the negative results.
thanks, everybody. So this is a question we do get a fair amount of time. So what happens if we have a student who is symptomatic with a temperature and then suddenly it goes away the next day, but maybe it's because they're on Tylenol or Advil? Is there any way for us to know that? Is there any way for us to kind of fight against that? What can be done there?
That one sounds like me. So we've had incidences where a child will come in and have been given Tylenol. No, the elementary students will tell on their parents every single time. My mom gave me some medicine before school today. We get that a lot. However, Tylenol usually with the true fever will not hold a child past 4 hours. They will start to show symptoms within 3 hours of getting to school.
We do know that those elementary students, if nothing, are very truthful, and sometimes we don't want them to be. I had an elementary student the other day say some things about my silver hair. So, all right, so next question. This is where we start to get into some questions about the numbers that we're seeing in the community, the trend of our COVID numbers going up and our incidence rates going up. And so one of the questions we're seeing is there some sort of magic number or a breaking point for us when we decide to move a whole school into e-learning? How is that? Is it about numbers? Is it about other things?
Allison, I'll take that one. There isn't a magic number. You know, we look at a variety of conditions, if you will. First of all, right now, from what we are seeing, the transmission, we're not seeing a lot of transmission within our schools. We are seeing, as we go through the contact tracing, we are seeing the cases coming into the school, but not being transmitted throughout. If we started to see that change a lot, certainly that is a piece of criteria that we would need to consider. Another heavy one, which is the vast majority of the reasons that we've pivoted to e-learning in the situations at schools, is do we have enough staff to go ahead and be able to staff this particular location? When we're thinking about bigger picture, I can see some of the questions that are not only about a school pivoting, but also just questions about the whole district pivoting and saying, hey, when is District 20 going to go completely e-learning? Again, same thing, no magic number. It's looking at a variety of pieces. It's looking at transmission and how that's occurring, whether it's within the school or more into the school. Again, it's staff. And it's social emotional well-being. We always take that into account when we're looking to make any decisions with respect to students and staff. And so no magic number. We know the benefit that students get from being, for those who want to be in person, there is tremendous benefit to that. And you know, the work that we do each day, that's why we don't over quarantine or under quarantine. We just try to do what's necessary because we know it is a big change. It is a big change if someone's an in-person learner to transfer, to transition to completely e-learning. Is any of that out of the question? It is not, but it really is a daily type of reflection that the superintendent engages in. Our superintendent, Mr. Gregory, also meets with the health department and other superintendents each week, stays very informed on the data, and is really constantly assessing these conditions that I mentioned. And so I can't give a magic number. Anything is on the table. A year from now, would we have ever guessed what we have gone through, if you will, in this past year? No. And so, you know, it's really about being able to assess the situation and to pivot in a way that best supports the community. And so that's really an ongoing process.
A question that piggybacks off of that nicely is many of you are asking, you know, right now my student is in-person learning, but as I'm seeing these COVID numbers rise throughout the community, I'm not really feeling safe about keeping them in person right now. So folks are wondering what other opportunities are there to maybe transition to a Journey K-8 or to an Accelerate at the high school level. And I think I can maybe jump in and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you will all actually get an email tomorrow for those of you in K through 8 that explains how you might take action at this next semester change to, if you want to move from Journey K-8 back to your neighborhood school, or if you want to go from your neighborhood school to Journey K-8, how that will actually work. So your timing is good to ask that question, as we talked about it in the Friday newsletter last Friday, and you will get an email communication about that tomorrow afternoon. Do I need to add anything else there? Did I miss anything? Okay. So let's get to another question. And this is another one that we do get a lot. So folks wonder, we tell everybody we take our guidance from El Paso County Public Health and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Why is it that we only take our guidance from those two entities and maybe not my physician or another expert in the medical industry?
I'd be happy to take that. So in fact, just this week, we got another communication. It's a 7-page document about in-person learning during COVID from the Colorado state level. And the county forwarded it to us today as well. And there's a specific line in it that schools, I'm going to read it right off of it because I have it here. Schools continue to be required to work with the state and the local health department in terms of following the guidance, the case guidance, the outbreak guidance that they give. So really it is not, it is their position as experts in that field. They are physicians, they are epidemiologists. And when I say physicians, I don't mean where like a pediatrician that you would go take your child to. The folks who are working for the health department, whether it's at the state or the county level, the expectation is that we follow that guidance. Where you see physicians come into play, certainly there's tremendous value in what they share, and we've always communicated that in this process. As we've communicated with El Paso County Public Health, we've always shared that we want a partnership with physicians, with family physicians as much as possible. You have relationships with them, they know your family, but what you can see right now where they come into play with those levels is protect our neighbor, where you can come back if you have a negative test or an alternate diagnosis. But in the level we're in right now, only the negative COVID test is to come back. And then finally, in the more restrictive level, it's a COVID test that's negative and the lab-based alternate diagnosis. So that's really where they fit in to that equation. They certainly bring tremendous value, but we also have to look at the guidance that we are given, because that's the guidance we're expected to follow from the state and the county level.
Thank you, Becky. I actually have a question here that I missed that I should have grouped it earlier. But one of the questions that people are asking is, when a school transitions to e-learning, why is it that maybe still after-school activities are allowed to happen, such as a football practice?
Sure, I can take that one. So it goes back to the definitions that we talked about earlier about being in quarantine. And those are people that have been in close contact with a symptomatic person or a positive diagnosis. So not everybody in the school falls under a quarantine when a school is transitioned to remote learning. And because of that, those students who are not a close contact of a symptomatic person or close contact with somebody who has been diagnosed positive, they can continue to participate in their other activities as they were previously scheduled, because just because the school has transitioned to e-learning, it doesn't mean the entire school has been placed in quarantine.
Thanks, Pete. So another question we got that's somewhat correlated to the rising numbers, but it's come up a few times, is as the numbers continue to go up, sounds like there's a little concern that, if you look at our numbers right now in the county, we would technically be at stay at home if we looked at the numbers where they are today. And so some folks have said, with the numbers all the way up there and the county still classifying us at a level 2, when will the school district step in and say, enough is enough, this is no longer safe? And so I can answer a little bit of that. I have the opportunity to be on calls with the city and the county and other communications professionals across the region. And we do know that when we placed into level 2, we have a few weeks to see if our mitigation efforts work. So even if we're seeing our numbers still climb, the state is still working with El Paso County Public Health to try to make sure our mitigation efforts are going to work. So you'll never see us skip a level or overnight, after we've put mitigation levels into place, immediately go to another level. So there's typically a 2 to 3 week lag in between changing those levels. So we'll work really closely with the county as they move those levels up. So I think that's just important to know that there is a process there. It's not like the county is ignoring the dial. It's not that they don't see those numbers climbing, but there's just a lot of back and forth that happens with the state health department and our local county health department before they start to move that dial. So hopefully that makes sense there. Let me see, let's move to we have a question here about e-learning, and folks are wondering, many people here are wondering, if we move to e-learning, will it look like e-learning did in the spring? And I believe this is coming from many of our elementary parents, because our high school parents have experienced that. And so maybe we can talk about that a little bit. If we had to move to e-learning, would it be different than in the spring, or would it be that same experience?
I would say that we pivoted so quickly in the spring. It was literally a few days' notice in terms of coming back and now, remotely teaching our students. Since that time, there has been a tremendous amount of professional learning. We offered multiple courses, and literally thousands of classes were completed to help our teachers really build their skill set and learn how to teach in that environment, because it is very different. And so we've truly made tremendous strides, because now we've had opportunity and time to put more learning involved, to understand the implications, to collaborate about how e-learning can occur. And so I think that the experience will be one that you see that there's more training and all of those pieces. And I think you would see that come through in the educational experience.
So we've had a few folks express, they've shared a story with maybe a personal question that they've got at their school, or maybe questioning how something was handled at their school, or moving forward if they have quarantine questions. Who do they contact? Is there a process there? Do they start with the school? Do they come to somebody at the school district? Who are the best people for those folks to reach out to?
I would recommend that they work directly with their schools. I think that's the best way to work through any questions that they have is approach their school.
I think too, I would add to that, Pete, one of the things to note early in this Microsoft Teams meeting, when we said, in the beginning, these huddles were maybe 5 huddles a day. And truly, I think one of the largest huddles that the COVID response team experienced was about 25 huddles in one day. And with that volume, we strive to do personal connection with everything when we're reaching out to people. And so what we mean by that is there's a phone call to alert people that they're in an isolation or a quarantine. But at the volume that we're receiving these, and at the speed in which we have to react, there are times when we have to simply send a text or an email to let people know what's happening, because as Becky talked about earlier, we can't just put it off and wait until we cross off the 5 other things on our list until we get to that next case. So as much as we want to have that personalized connection with somebody over the phone, there are times when you may only get an email or a text from us letting you know what those next steps are. Not our preferred method, but sometimes that's just the best and quickest way we have to do it, especially when that happens late in the evening or on a weekend. Sometimes those are happening after 9 o'clock. So just wanted to clarify that a little bit. Okay, I'm going to scan through these one more time and see what we've got that's outstanding. We did have one other question. When you mentioned that you wait the 4 days when you're determining the cases, people are wondering, how does that slow the spread if you don't really know what's happening in those 4 days?
So I'm happy to take a shot at this, and then maybe Marcia can add in a little bit after I've finished. So it's important to understand that during the 4-day period, the symptomatic individual is not in school. Ideally, parents are making sure that they are checking with their kids for symptoms before coming in. And so during that 4-day period, typically, there's not a symptomatic person that's in that cohort or classroom to continue spreading anything, whether it's COVID or whether it is some whatever random virus I got a few weeks ago. So in the end, that we do have a lot of other prevention or spread prevention controls that are in place, from mask wearing to not having people move about freely within the schools, and everything else that we're doing all serves to help prevent the spread during that 4-day period. Marcia, would you like to add on to that?
No, I think you've got it pretty well there. During that 4-day period, the student who is actually ill is not in the classroom. So there's nobody that is actually ill in the classroom during that 4-day period. What we're looking at the end of that 4-day period, if we have not confirmed that this child is negative for COVID or positive for COVID during that 4-day period, is once we go to quarantine, it's to make sure that we separate all the children. So if another one does become ill because of contact 4 days ago with, or 5 days ago with that one ill student, it's not going to spread randomly among all the students. I would say that would be the main reason for the quarantine on the 5th day.
I think the other thing to keep in mind too is that, you know, the red box ones, the ones that come from the critical symptoms, the ones that come from contact with positive or the positive cases themselves are those higher risk ones that are there. In a lot of cases for the yellow boxes, we don't know what the cause of those symptoms are, and they can present like many other things like we talked earlier. So we want to give it some time, number one, to see if it clears in 24 hours, to see if it clears in 48 hours, and to get more information about what's going on through testing to make a more informed decision about that quarantine. That's why the evaluation period holds, because some of these things can be very different. They could be strep, they could be other things, as we talked about earlier.
Okay, so we've gotten a couple more questions where folks are sharing some individual concerns. And so I just want to make sure that this sounds right. So if you have a concern at your school, maybe you aren't in agreement with how e-learning is happening, or maybe you have a question about a quarantine, we always recommend starting that conversation first with the teacher. And if you can't get resolution there, then we ask that you go to the leadership of that school, reach out to the principal, the assistant principal, and look for resolution. And if you're still unhappy with how that's working, then we would escalate that to the district level. But we always ask that you start at that teacher, school leadership level first to make sure that they can address the concerns before you bring it to the district level, because oftentimes we'll have to go right back to the school with you to sort of find out what's happening. Did I miss anything there, everyone? Okay. Okay. So there, we had a great question just come up about masks. So early on, we talked about how the quarantining and isolation has some variance or with close contacts if there was a mask or no mask. So some folks are wondering, are all teachers required to wear masks? And if they see a teacher without masks, does that mean that there's a possibility that they have some sort of exemption? And is it also possible that students get mask exemptions, and how does that work?
For a mask exemption, someone would have to have a qualifying medical condition that they cannot wear a mask. We do have an exemption that we work with the significant special needs students, the students with autism who will not tolerate something rubbing against their face because of sensory issues. And a doctor needs to sign that and explain why the student needs to. So it's to not wear a mask. And most of the doctors are allowing us to work with the students to wear a mask if they're working closely with someone for short periods. I know they have been taking these students outside and working with them more to diminish any kind of spread with them. We're also working with these students to wear face shields to afford some amount of protection.
And for staff, again, we follow the state and county guidelines. There's a mask mandate still in effect to wear a mask that includes a face covering over the nose and mouth. And so that is our expectation for staff as well.
Okay. So we have one follow-up question around that lab test. And I even remember, wow, when we first learned about that lab test, I was like, what's a lab test for a runny nose, right? Like, so we've got just looking for a little more clarification around is there a lab test for something like the common cold or some of those other symptoms?
There is a full respiratory panel that will actually pull out a common cold. I've only seen a few doctors send it in. But again, even if they ran with just the panel for the common cold, you have to remember that we not only need the respiratory panel results, we also need the PCR test saying that they are also negative for COVID.
So as I've gone through the questions, it's looking like those big thematic questions have all been addressed. We're at 7:20. We technically have 10 more minutes. I'd like to give about 30 to 60 seconds for folks who have any last minute questions to go ahead and put those in the chat. So we'll just, we'll be silent here for about 60 seconds and give folks one last opportunity. And maybe one more time, Marcia, can you explain what the PCR means?
Michael actually explains that much better than I do with the PCR. The PCR test, Michael, would you spell it out?
Sure, absolutely. Basically, high level, it's a molecular test. So they're actually looking for parts of RNA of that COVID virus to kind of go through that. And so they're kind of replicating strands of DNA to try to get that test to give a result back, which is why it takes time for that to happen. I want to say that the words stand for polymerase chain reaction. I could be wrong, but that's what I remember. So that is a molecular test. That's opposed to like an antigen test, which is looking for a different thing that can be done more quickly. That's the rapid test. And finally, there's an antibody test, which is a blood test. And that's done to seek, a lot of times in those cases, is to see if someone's had it. But there are some antibodies tests that also allow you to know if someone has it currently. And again, I think the point earlier, somebody said something in the question, and it was a good thing to actually ask. No, we don't want students coming to school sick, even with the common cold. In any case, our normal procedures exist. That if somebody has a fever, they shouldn't be at school for 24 hours after that fever. It doesn't matter what you've got. Those same things still fall into place for being at school. We don't want you at school sick. We want you to stay home. So.
And I think we'll end on this future forward question. And I don't know that we can answer it, but it's worth talking about. Gotten a couple questions about what will happen when there's a vaccine. Do we know what the impacts of that will look like, how we might deal with that? I know we don't have a crystal ball, but any words of wisdom on vaccine? I guess maybe what I can just share with you is I was on a conference call with the governor about a week ago, and at a state level, the state is just now starting to talk about how would we roll out a vaccine. And they had to submit their plan for rolling out a vaccine about 2.5 weeks ago. So what we know is it's still very early. The state is planning how that would work. It would likely be handed out to the folks in our medical industry first, our first responders. And that was some of the language that the state had around that. So what we do know is we would work closely with the governor, we would work closely with Colorado Department of Education, Public Health and Environment, and our local El Paso County Public Health to really figure out how vaccines, how that would impact our learning environments and how those would be rolled out. So with that, there were so many questions, so many great questions. I'm certain I probably missed a few here and there. So I want to apologize if I did miss your question. Know that we will put this recording and the accompanying PowerPoint on the website. Hopefully we'll get that up early tomorrow, if not by late afternoon. So we'll get that up as soon as we can. Sometimes that does take us a little more time because we have to go in and fix the closed captioning for any of our community members who may have hearing impairments. So if we don't get that up right away, know that we're just working on those closed captioning so everyone in the community can listen and participate in this. And I'd like to thank the COVID response team for spending their evening and their their expertise with us. I'd like to thank all of you for letting us be a part of your evening. I'm sure we were probably around some kitchen tables and some living rooms, and so we thank you for letting us into your home. And I'd also like to thank a few people behind the scenes, Crystal Story and Samantha LaBerge, and also our friends in IT for helping us get this Microsoft Teams meeting set up and working so well. And I think with that, we'll call it. We'll let everybody go on with their evening. Know that these resources are on the web. And when you have questions, please get those to your schools and we'll work with them to get clarity. And with that, we'll say good evening. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you next time.